And anyway, one of the things about this, I came out of Hungary and then to America and the Cold War and all of this, was that I was something of a conservative. But here is a sort of pivotal point of my intellectual development. I remember at one point I was wondering why the American government does not support sports more than it does, because they leave the Soviets do that and they get beaten up and they lose the propaganda warfare. But then I thought, but wait a minute, that's precisely the difference between the Soviets and the Americans. The Americans leave sports to be out there, to be done by the population and not by the government. What am I talking about? And these things really came out of my own thinking at the time. It wasn't all somebody prompting me or wagging his finger and saying, oh, you're contradicting yourself. I was so engrossed by these matters that I did figure them out. And so I became an opponent of government-subsidized sports, and then eventually of government-subsidized anything. And I realized that if you read the Declaration of Independence close, it's pretty much in there that the function of the government is to secure our rights. And that's the end of it. They're like referees on a game, They're not supposed to get involved in consoling the losers or helping the uniforms or whatever. And so I became very much a libertarian, and I always thought that that was basically the politics of objectivism, too. I never paid any attention of Rand's ranting about libertarians and hippies of the right and all that stuff, because I think that was more like polemics. And I did think that libertarianism captured quite accurately the radical capitalism of Ayn Rand. And I was convinced that that is really the way a society ought to be organized, that the only function that the referees have is to make sure that the rules are vigilantly adhered to, and the rest of it is to the players. And the very sad thing about the left is that they have consigned human beings to the role of puppets so that they don't have any personal initiative, and so they have no confidence in people ever picking up the ball and running with it themselves, unless the government boosts them. Exactly why the government people have the capacity to initiate good conduct, but the rest of us don't, has always mystified me. And I've never been able to understand why the left doesn't understand this paradox about it. Why is it that they, in the government, can stimulate the economy, but we, outside of the government, are powerless to do so? Makes no sense to me. But gradually, I started to pay more attention to what was the major difference between that system and this one. The Cold War fascinated me because I had direct experience with one side of it, and then I was slowly beginning to get direct experience with the other side. And then I wanted to make some sense of the difference. Was I actually justified, ultimately, in abandoning communist Hungary and fleeing to more or less capitalist Western Europe and eventually America? And what really energized my interest was the Kennedy-Nixon debates. Now, by that time I was old enough, but I was mostly just enjoying life in the Air Force. And then that debate focused my attention on politics. And then that was in, I don't know, 1960, 61 or something. I remember it was just about the time that I discovered Rand, so it all coalesced for me very nicely. And one of the things that Rand did for me more than anything else is underlined for me the importance of valuing oneself. I had had very, very brutal parents. Both of my parents were athletic fanatics, and they wanted me to follow their lead into athletics. And I wanted to read books, so there was not a very good match. And my father was especially brutal, and I was under his rule for 3 years. He was a Nazi, he was an anti-Semite. I detested him, and he constantly belittled me. That was his way of trying to gain control over me. He was always telling me how terrible a decision it was that he brought me out from Hungary and all that. So when I finally ran away from home at age 18 in Cleveland, where we lived, I was kind of a lonely guy, kind of lost. But I always had a kind of a basic confidence that I deserved more than what my dad was giving me, which is why I ran from the house. And then when I discovered Rand, it made sense of the notion that human beings are important and that they're not to be dismissed, and that caring for them, including yourself, is a vital ethical imperative, And that's how this whole ethical egoism that came out of the virtue of the virtue of selfishness, which also has the subtitle that most people forget, a new concept of egoism, not the old Hobbesian concept, energized me tremendously, and I became something of a Rand scholar, but always a little bit on my own because I never quite fit with any of the groups that were developing around. Although it turns out, in the last analysis, I am probably closer to her than many of the members of those groups. So anyway, that's a sort of a short story of the development up to this point, up until I decided to go to graduate school and continue my studies. I got a great deal out of studying Leo Strauss because he reminded me of Plato and Aristotle and the ancients and so on, which in my time were completely neglected in graduate school. We barely touched. We touched on a little Kant and maybe some Descartes, but Aristotle was neglected, and so was Thomas, and so was, Anselm. All those classical thinkers were not part of the curriculum. Instead, it was all Wittgenstein and Ryle and Reichenbach and these cats of the early 20th century, logical positivism and logical empiricism, and Quine became, prominent, and that sort of offset the concentration on these newer philosophers. And that, together with Rand, I think gave me a fairly nicely rounded philosophical education. Probably not as sharp as some other people, but sharp enough for me. Okay, well, very first, I started to do philosophy in Air Force. They were offering some night courses, and one of them was taught by a guy named Peter Diamandopoulos, who was an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, and he used to come out to Andrews and have this 3-hour philosophy course once a week, and I took it, and he fascinated me. The man was Greek to begin with a big white hair, okay? Walked up and down on the podium and just talked and talked about Aristotle and about Descartes, about others. And I was absolutely taken by this. It just fit me to the T. I thought, this is what I got to do. Now, I wasn't yet set on philosophy, but I realized that this was academic work. And then when I left the service and I went into undergraduate school at Claremont, I tried to do political science for a while and a little psychology. None of them made any sense to me. Clearly, none of them resonated until I went to a philosophy class. And then there was something about philosophy. What I really liked about it is that there was no party line in the classroom. It was a potpourri, a smorgasbord. We studied different schools of thought and how these different schools of thought approached the various problems of philosophy. And that was a sort of openness and liberty that appealed to me. You didn't have to cater to the professor. You could just go ahead with your work. And as long as you were reasonably coherent in your papers and your tests, you could succeed. And so I stayed with it, and that was sort of like my initial step into academic philosophy.